Hello, and welcome to this podcast series on food authenticity. My name is Will Suter. In this episode, we'll be continuing our conversation with Selvarani Elahi, Sterling Crew, and Mark Woolfe from the Food Authenticity Network. If you missed the first part of the interview, do make sure to go back and listen to the previous episode of this podcast as well. Obviously, in the last year or so, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a huge impact on all industries. We're recording this podcast in 4 different rooms, whereas because we're all in the UK, in other circumstances, we might have met up to do it. So, Sterling, how has the pandemic impacted this area of food fraud and the food industry in general? And how do you think this is going to affect the trajectory into the near future?
Well, I think it has and it hasn't. Basically, it's still too early to know. But what we do know is that the conditions created by this terrible pandemic have made it a better space for fraudsters to operate in. And we've seen lots of disruption, both as regulators. Obviously, the regulators aren't getting around as much as they were before, so the whole supply chain becomes a bit more opaque. We know commercially we have independent auditors and people doing analysis. A lot less of that's been going on. But people are trying to come up with new innovative techniques to try to get around that. So we've seen remote audits, a lot of remote testing. But to me, it's the conditions that are created in the global supply network. Suddenly, your traditional supplier that you've been working with for years, you have a great profile of the product, you know about all their systems, you have confidence, sometimes just disappears because of COVID. And you're having to go to a new supplier, and then you're trying to build up that level of confidence again, do that analysis. So it is a great place for a food fraudster to operate in. But at the moment, we haven't seen a kind of huge amount of increase, and that could be because we're not doing the testing again yet. And when we go back to normal levels of testing, normal levels of audit, maybe then we'll start to see things that have happened in the past. But definitely we need to be on our guard. And our advice, and it's the same advice from FAN as we've got from the Food Standards Agency, is look, we've got robust tools here. And we've been fortunate in some ways with the incident of the horse meat scandal. Although it was a terrible thing, the Elliott Review encourages us to have a far more robust approach to food fraud. We've seen things like VASAP develop. We've seen FIN, the food industry, their intelligence network come. We've seen the National Food Crime Unit come out. We've seen that ourselves, FAN, the Food Authenticity Network. We've seen people now using this VASAP in the same way they used HACCP, this vulnerability assessment for fraud. So I think we're in quite a good place. And really the messages we were sending out to people is don't try to do something different in this terrible conditions to fight food fraud. Use the tools you've got and make sure they're being used. As I say, we've seen lots of new smart technology coming in as well, like blockchain, which is all again, new things that are helping to strengthen our fight against food fraudsters. But I don't think it's as bad as it could have been in the UK. Well, I have heard from friends who are other parts of the world who don't have that facility, saying they wish they did have it. So things like FIN, the National Food Crime Unit, a lot of countries are looking at us being quite jealous, thinking, what a terrific support system you've got, and the way that we've adapted VASAP right through our food supply chain has really, really, really strengthened our approach.
Yeah, we've definitely heard the same thing on the podcast before from guests in the US who are quite jealous of the UK's sort of infrastructure around this stuff, because there's just not nearly the same amount of attention in the US given to this sort of thing. Largely because, especially post the horse meat scandal and the Elliott Review and that sort of thing, the UK's response seems to be sort of held in quite high esteem around the world. So I think this approach of kind of sharing that knowledge and that expertise globally is a good one.
There are a lot of thoughts about Professor Chris Elliott's report, and a lot of people thought it would just be kicked into the long grass, to be honest with you. It's another report, nothing will happen. But I think industry really saw the fantastic value of it, and government really got behind it, the FSA did, and I think that's why we've been successful. There was a will across the whole supply chain. It was such a terrible thing to go through, and we needed to do it for consumer confidence.
Yeah, definitely. So how does the role of sort of national governments play into this? How do they play into avoiding food fraud and ensuring food authenticity? Mark, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Well, obviously, the most important thing the government has to do is to have the best legislative framework to prosecute food fraud. So that's the basis of all the main fight against food fraud is having a good legislative framework to do so. And then the next thing, obviously, is having a good enforcement system and a strong enforcement system to be able to investigate and prosecute if necessary. And the UK government, as we've seen, has reacted to this by creating the National Food Control Unit in the FSA and the Scottish Food Crime Unit in Scotland as well. And these are now becoming more and more active. They've been given extra budgets to investigate food fraud, and I think as time goes on, they're going to get stronger and stronger in this area. Obviously, the other issue that government role was important, as we've spoken already, was setting up the network and having this resilient network of laboratories to be able to face future incidents. So I think this again puts the UK in a very much stronger position than perhaps other countries.
And we are fortunate, aren't we, guys, that we have some terrific government support. On our board, we have representatives from DEFRA, the Food Standards Agency, Food Standards Scotland, and BEIS as well. So we do get some great support from government, which means that we can do our job a lot better than we could have done otherwise.
Yeah, we also have a representative from JRC, the European Commission, which I think is very important because we have very good links with other organizations and scientists around the world. I mean, Selvarani's built up a very good relationship with the US scientists who are both teaching and have research in food fraud. And we have very good links with European institutions as well through the European projects that I've participated in, and the other people have as well, the contacts we have. So we have very good links with both governments and institutions around the world, I think, in this respect.
I think a key to what both Sterling and Mark are saying is really that everyone agrees that, food fraud doesn't respect any boundaries or country borders. It is a truly global phenomenon. So it's only by working together, I think, that we can be more prepared. And I think governments are now starting to recognize that. And there was the Global Alliance on Food Crime that was formed probably in, I think, 2018. And the pandemic has sort of stemmed the progress of that, because obviously that was the Five Eyes. So it was UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US meeting in different locations. Now that's switched to a virtual format, but I did have a meeting with the current chair of the Global Alliance on Food Crime. That's Ron McNaughton of the Scottish Food Crime and Incidents Unit, and he's keen that we have a united sort of UK front, and we'll be collaborating through the Food Authenticity Network with him, saying that it doesn't make sense for each country to have its own network, because food fraud is global, and we've already have an architecture here with a network that's now 6 years old, that other governments should join the UK approach, and by having bespoke pages for each of those governments, we can truly build a global network in one platform, so then it's easy for people to operate rather than have a different platform for all the different countries that we operate in.
So, Selvarani, as Mark mentioned before, you've got quite a few links, as you say there, to other organizations globally and in the US. Are there any other projects that you've been working on, or companies, communities you've been working with to kind of bring them into this effort, this global effort on food authenticity?
Yeah, so as I said, when the network was set up, it was very much a government initiative, and the government, as Sterling said, accepted all the recommendations of the Elliott Review report and have really put in place some good projects and initiatives to support that. One of which is the Food Authenticity Network. But they were quite clear in the beginning that they would set it up, but eventually that we needed to develop a sustainable model which involved other parties. So the original remit is that the network would operate from government funding for 2 years, and that the hope was that industry would take this on. But because industry is quite disparate, the dairy industry might think, why am I reporting methods on wines and vice versa? And they very much felt that government still needed to be involved. So then we continued with government funding for another 2 years. But in the beginning of 2019, we developed a public-private partnership model, a bit like sort of scientific crowdfunding, where we're asking for small amounts of money from lots of different people on the basis that everybody should be invested in preventing food fraud. So government still inputs quite significantly into the program. So we have funding from BEIS that allows us to operate the network on an open access basis for everyone in the world. And then we have DEFRA, FSA and FSS sort of now looking at gaps in the network and where we can supplement the information there. And we also have industry now, and you'll see at the slides that we share later that we have a number of industry organizations that are supporters of the network. So they offer us a small amount of financial support, and for that we half of that goes to supporting the network, and half of it will do some joint projects where we're aligned, and that's really been quite successful. We've very recently just brought on another industry supporter, and we're in discussion with another one, and the next key target for us is to bring on board some other governments. So as I said, we really believe that food fraud is global, and it's only by working together that we're going to create this sort of global network. And we are in discussion with another project in the Asia Pacific region, where hopefully we'll be able to add some bespoke pages for 19 other countries. I did want to just highlight some work that we've been doing with DEFRA on a DEFRA food fraud project, where we were commissioned to look at the global drivers of food fraud. So this was a project that was commissioned really in preparation for EU exit, and on the basis that now the UK is responsible for the safety and authenticity of all food consumed in the UK, both food made in the UK and also imported into the UK. And what that project found in phase one was that there were some global drivers of food fraud, and it was just at the beginning of the pandemic. So pandemic was one of the things that an expert work group identified. Climate change, lack of enforcement. EU exit was very high because at the time it was carried out in January 2019. So, we were still in the EU, but very much on the exit path. Price pressures, food shortages, legislation loopholes, and consumer demand was another area where actual demand for high value products, for example, olive oil or organic produce, actually drives the market and creates opportunities for fraud. And also, Sterling already touched on this about low penalties for food crime and food fraud in the UK. So although food law is criminal law in the UK, the penalty is often associated when people are actually caught and not an actual deterrent, don't seem to deter people because they might be quite modest in relation to the size of the company. There have been new sentencing guidelines since the horse meat, because I think this is a recognised problem, and recently we have seen much higher fines being applied, rightly so, especially in sort of allergens cases where actually you can cause people to die through inadvertent mislabeling or negligence. So this has been quite interesting, but also something that came through is criminality, and the Elliott report really introduced the concept of food crime and organised criminals working in the area. But also our literature review showed that actually, although you might have all these drivers, you need the drivers to create the situation where food fraud could happen. But within a company, you do need a system weakness. So there must be an opportunity within your company and the systems you have in order for that to happen. And ultimately, it comes up to an individual or a group of individuals to decide that they're going to commit this fraud. So as well as thinking about organized crime, I think companies ought to look at individual criminality, because it's happening. Somebody's making that decision to switch between legal practice and then suddenly say, well, I need to do this in order to make more money or feed my children, whatever their personal driver is. So there's quite a lot of work being done in the last 5 years on looking at company culture and trying to embed a culture of excellence in the company, so that everybody's working to the same standard, taking pride in the work they do and pride in the products they produce. And that's creating this sort of food safety and authenticity culture. So at the moment, companies seem to be looking at things that really they can't influence very much, looking at market trends, commodity prices to try and track to see where the next trigger will be for food fraud. But also, I think they can do quite a lot looking at their own system weaknesses and making sure all of their staff are trained to know the difference between sort of right and wrong. That sounds quite patronizing, but you know what I mean? It can be quite intricate, whereas in some places, bulking out foods might not be seen as a criminal activity. It might just be that you don't have this food supply chain coming in. Oh, I've got to substitute it with this, and that's okay. So that project's been quite interesting to do, and we're in phase 2 at the moment where we're looking at tools, and we've just reported that to DEFRA, looking at all of the tools available to mitigate food fraud, and that's been a very interesting project. I can't say anything about that because it hasn't been approved by DEFRA yet.
We're just going to take another short break now to remind you why we're here talking about food authenticity. Bruker's Food Screener is an analysis platform based on automated NMR spectroscopy, which profiles the complex mixtures of compounds which make up products like wine, honey, and juices, and compares them to an extensive database to determine their botanical and geographical origins. This technology is becoming an immensely powerful tool in the global fight against food fraud. If you want to learn how Food Screener could help you ensure the authenticity of your food products, or if you just want to know more about the technology, then please go to bruker.com/foodscreener and reach out to a Bruker expert. Now let's return to the conclusion of our conversation with our guests from the Food Authenticity Network.
So just to kind of bring it back to kind of the personal side of things again, like how did you all get involved in food fraud? Like what motivated you all to get involved in food authenticity? And what kind of message would you give to any people listening who are interested in kind of doing more in this area, beyond kind of their own role, or getting involved?
Just to say briefly, it was about 40 years ago where I got interested in food fraud. There was something called Operation Meat Hook. I used to live in Hammersmith, and there was a huge food fraud going on using unfit meat. And so even back when I was kind of in my early 20s, I suddenly became aware in my own locality that we'd been eating a lot of meat that we shouldn't have been eating. And it's that food safety kind of element of it that has drawn me to food fraud throughout my professional career.
Well, I've been involved with food fraud for about over 30 years, actually, because I began by helping to set up the food authenticity program in MAF. It shows how old I am, actually, which then moved to the Food Standards Agency. And we had a very active program. Not only I was involved with legislation, trying to make sure there was a very good framework, so that's why I've spoken about that, but also applying, when we developed the research methods, applying them in surveys and finding where the issues were in the UK market in particular. So we had both the methodology and the discovering the problems, and I think having that made a very strong system. And also, we had the confidence of the industry at the time as well. So we were getting a lot of intelligence, which I think is a very important aspect of food fraud, is having the intelligence from industry in particular, who know the problems in the food chain. They know what's going on. They know where food is being sold far too cheaply to be really genuine. And therefore, we were getting that information and being able to tailor our program to try and resolve those issues. So, and that, I think, is still very much a good lesson to take home today, actually, that you need intelligence, you need research, and then you need investigation to really discover where the issues are.
So just to kind of wrap up, it seems like at the moment, in this kind of field of food authenticity, in a lot of areas, the current moment seems to be a bit of a turning point in terms of people sort of changing and updating their approach to it, this sort of cross-industry collaboration. So while it's still a big issue, it seems to me that the kind of trajectory of where the next few years are going on sort of food authenticity is a much more positive space. So I don't know if you maybe agree with that, or could you talk a bit about where you see kind of the next maybe 5 years or so going in this field, and if you have any sort of hopeful views on where we might end up.
I think what I'd say I've seen is the change from being very parochial, worried about what's going on in our own countries and our own area, to a recognition now that we're all in it together. This is a global problem. And that's largely been driven also not just by governments cooperating, not just by networks like ourselves, but commercially. You can see retailers now who are global retailers recognizing it more than perhaps anyone else because they have that visibility. And I think the other hope for the future is new smart technologies that are coming in. We've seen how that's having a huge impact. Often we have lots and lots of data, millions of points of data, and it's trying to interpret what that data is actually telling us. There's no story to it. And now with new smart technologies, a lot of people are using artificial intelligence, AI, and they're now crunching those numbers and getting real stories out. And we've seen the development of blockchain as well over the last couple of years, and that's just in its early stages still. But that's helping us with traceability. So there's this general cultural shift that this is a global issue. There's a recognition how important it is, and there's now new technologies that are being developed specifically on the back of this interest and this drive.
And Selvarani, do you agree with that? Does that tie in with what you see with more labs getting involved and new techniques coming on board?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think in the UK, post the horse meat incident and the initiatives and the implementation of the Elliott Review recommendations has really put us in a very good place. So we now have 2 crime units in the UK, so one in Scotland and one at the Food Standards Agency. And we've already touched on this. The Food Industry Intelligence Network has now got 48 members. So these are people that are competitors, really. They work in the same space, but they've come together to share data anonymously for the greater good because they can see the value in sharing this data. It's anonymized and there's a safe haven created. But what that's enabled people to do is look at trend analysis. So rather than an individual company maybe looking at just 100 results, by pooling all of the results, they've got, say, 5,000 results, and then you can do much more detailed analysis. And then that will say, well, actually, we've looked at meat species for the last 5 years. We don't really need to carry on looking at meat species. Why don't we look at some other new problems? So they're actually changing their sort of analytical testing strategies based on pooling data, which I think is a big step forward. And there's nothing quite like FIN anywhere else in the world. And we're acting really as a showcase and sort of leading in this area. And also the Food Authenticity Network has been really satisfying for me to be involved in this initiative and see it grow from the inception to where we are now. And we benefit from Mark's 20, 30 years of food authenticity experience and curating the information in a way that's appealing to people. Because actually with so much information at the moment, we've got information overload. People don't have time to visit umpteen different websites or even be able to take the data and information in. So the fact that there is a website that does this for you, and one of the key benefits of being a member is that we send out a monthly highlights email of all of our activities. So on one email, you get links to all of the information with the links to our training pages and food fraud mitigation pages. And we hope that we're having sort of impact this way, that being able to package information in a way that's readily accessible for all our users. Blockchain, people have talked about that for a long time, saying that's going to solve everything in the world and that it's going to sort of solve all our food supply chain issues. I think it depends on the commodity. So there's still pilots going on. So you can see if you have a single commodity like a banana, you could trace that from a farm, wherever it's grown, to a retail shelf quite easily, relatively easily. But if you've got something like a lasagna, which might have 30 ingredients from all corners of the world, trying to blockchain all of that and fit it in, it's more complex. So I think that's a challenge at the moment. And also there are lots of different people working in the blockchain environment, and the systems don't necessarily talk to each other. So ideally, we want a common platform that all suppliers in the world can sort of integrate into. And once we get to that level, you can see it would be much easier to see where products are flowing and coming from. But blockchain will definitely play a role in assuring food supply chains going forward. And from an analytical testing point of view, there are exciting sort of handheld devices and screening devices, I think, that will help us triage information. It's not to say that some of these devices have the same accuracy as a £500,000 instrument in a laboratory, but they can be fit for purpose. They might be able to allow you to screen in a plant and say, this is the quality of ingredient I'm looking for. And yes, it passes or it fails. If it fails, then it can go on to laboratory testing for further investigation. So I think it's quite an exciting time, certainly in the UK, to be involved in food authenticity and food integrity issues. And I think we're looking forward for the Food Authenticity Network to play a role in that going forward.
Mark, obviously you've got a lot of experience in this field. What the other two guys have said, does that tie in with what you see? Do you think there is a kind of a shift at the moment in the kind of general attitudes in this space?
Yes, I mean, I agree very much that we're looking now at a much more global aspect to food fraud than perhaps we were when I first started, of course, because of the developments, and it's very pleasing to see that this is happening. I still feel a little bit worried about the government budget situation. We do rely quite a lot on having the budget to develop new methods. And as we know, government is having problems often funding these areas. So I just hope that, keep my fingers crossed, that the Food Authenticity Programme will continue in the future to develop the methods so that we can be one step ahead all the time of the fraudsters. But also, I think that will, to some extent, be compensated by having these more global networks where we can perhaps do this work cooperatively, as we have done in the past with quite large European projects. We mentioned Food Integrity, which was a very successful project. I was also involved with an earlier one called Trace, which similar developed a lot of methodology for both traceability and food authenticity testing. So again, we are hoping that these the networks and the contacts we've built up around the world is going to make the progress of this in a much more global way than we have done in the past. I'm fairly confident about that. The UK has led the way, I think, in this.
Closing remark for me. Please join the Food Authenticity Network. It's free. It's a global network. So wherever you are in the world, you've got access to it. It's open access network. It's a great place to see other people doing the same work as you. It gives you great horizon scanning, and you become part of a community that is fighting food fraud. I do hope you'll join us.
Excellent. That's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you all for your time, for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Will.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So, many thanks to Selvarani, Mark and Sterling there for sharing their expertise and experience with us over the last 2 episodes. I hope you enjoyed that discussion. As always, if you want to learn more about how Bruker's NMR spectroscopy tools can help to verify the authenticity of your food products, or if you want more details on their technology platforms, visit bruker.com/foodscreener, where there are plenty of resources available, and you can contact a Bruker expert as well if you have more questions. Thanks for listening.